Hi, my name's Tanya Howard. I'm presenting today on behalf of my research team at the University of New England in Australia. Thanks for popping in. The project that I'm reporting on is officially titled The Human Dimensions of Environmental Crime, and we're funded by the Bushfires and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, and our partner on the ground is the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. The project kicked off in October 2019, and since then many factors have combined to slow down the research. So today I'll just be providing an overview of what we've done so far rather than the detailed results I might have thought we'd have by now. And so these are components of the research project, and I'll touch on most of those today, and particularly want to draw your attention to the community of practice model that we've set up. It's a two-way forum to communicate with our partner, present research findings to them, receive feedback, and hopefully, as we go through the project, make it the most useful we can for those people that we're working with in the agency. So I just wanted to refer briefly to the title of the presentation, Bushfire Country, which recognises that although bushfires are a feature of post-colonial settlement in Australia, our case study site, Victoria, has experienced some of the worst, most deadly and destructive fires in the country. And sadly, you will have seen some of these on the news probably during January this year. You can see in this graphic here, there's quite a lot of high risk and out of control fires taking place in the southeast corner of the state. Victoria is quite a small state within the context of Australia, being a big landmass, but it's got quite a high density population for us anyway. So 6.5 million people, the majority of those living in metro areas. And although people are living in the metro areas, the non-metropolitan areas, the rural and regional areas are quite easily accessible by good highway network and public transport. So our project is focusing on state forests in Victoria. These are important and contested sites, and they're not afforded the protection of a national park in a conservation sense. Instead, they're considered multi-use sites which require active government management. There's a tension between conservation, production and recreation values in state forests. And particularly important in this setting is that forestry is an established industry in Victoria since settlement opened it up, and it's had a very big economic driver for the state. The majority of forestry takes place in public lands, in native forests. And you can see here, if we just pay attention to this southeast corner where the fires were particularly bad, having a look here on this map where you can see that area of the state is where the largest sort of proportion of native forest production takes place. So for those who don't know Australia well, you can see the little blue map there, Victoria down in the corner, and we're looking at this little southeast corner here where the fires were quite bad, to notice that there's obviously a lot of forestry there, and also the purple areas, there's nature conservation and minimal use sites that are adjacent to the forestry parts. So you can see as well on this other side that the public lands there, the dark green. So you can just see that area there is quite close to Melbourne. So it's the capital of Victoria, accessible sites where people, it's a very complex public policy area as well, trying to balance those economic benefits of forestry with conservation, traditional customs of access to firewood use, with people to harvest their own firewood in these areas for community members, and now an increasing desire and pressures for recreational access to these sites. I'll just mention our partner. So the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning had a lot of regulatory functions, but in 2018 an independent investigation was launched in response to the failure of the department to prosecute Victoria forests for rainforest logging breaches in those native forest production areas. So Vic Forests is a state-owned business that's responsible for harvesting and commercial sale and regrowth of timber. So there was an independent review that identified that the existing regulatory system was inadequate, and issues such as lack of transparency around the regulatory processes used and how they're applied, a lot of community distrust in the integrity of the regulator, fears of corruption and conflict of interest were highlighted. And in response to that, the department formed the Office of the Conservation Regulator, and that's who we're working with now. So they were established in 2019, bringing together under in one office all the different environmental regulators across, that had been sort of spread through the department. So centrally coordinated. We could see this as an effort to regain the regulatory licence to operate, and a large rebrand has gone along with this restructure. You can see the key mission here is at the centre of the graphic: to become an effective, trusted, best practice regulator. And what we've sort of noted, I won't go into any great detail, but this rebranding has really started to draw a lot on key concepts from behavioural psychology and persuasive communications. So using the language of behaviour change, starting to apply some of the methodologies that come from the behaviour change approach, and also using the terminology that we associate with this sort of behavioural focus. So looking for the drivers of behaviour, the barriers, the benefits, and therefore what sort of interventions might be developed in a regulatory sense to improve the regulator's performance. So why are they starting to go down this path? Well, the regulator is operating in a constrained environment that's really starting to challenge a traditional regulatory practice model. Those constraints include financial, staff restraints, like less people on the ground, less people out there at the enforcement, on the grassroots, more political lobbying, highly politicised issues, and therefore changes and variations in political will to follow through with particular regulations. And then of course the actual constraint of managing the natural resource base itself. State forests are easily degraded through overuse or misuse, and particularly then when we have environmental issues such as drought, like we had at the start of the year, or bushfires, the natural resource becomes more and more vulnerable to mismanagement. So there's been a shift in the policy environment, which has seen a reduction in enforcement capacity on the ground. And one way that this has been framed in a sort of regulatory response is to look for a corresponding increase in community goodwill and engagement with the regulations. So looking for the community to sort of step up and I guess self-regulate. So this is being framed as a risk-based approach to managing the state forests. This is the justification and the explanation, the sort of logic behind this new approach. It's essentially, as you can see here on the graphic, that the conservation regulator is reducing enforcement effort for low to medium risks. And you can see that in the quote there as well from their compliance and enforcement policy. As a result, there's a growing need to understand the conditions that might improve voluntary compliance. And this is where our research hopes to contribute. So the regulator has adopted another strategy to increase transparency and hopefully improve trust with their affected communities. And they're implementing a process of risk analysis to determine their annual regulatory priorities. They base this risk analysis on their knowledge of environmental condition and the environmental and compliance risks that they understand at the time, so from their own data. This year they've identified 4 key regulatory areas to focus on: illegal campfires, illegal take of firewood, illegal vehicle use on public land, and unauthorised timber harvesting in native forests, which was the trigger for the inquiry that I mentioned earlier. So in an environmental crime framing, these might seem to be quite low-level behaviours. They're quite mundane and everyday, but as a result, they're very widespread across the state and have the potential to have quite a big cumulative impact on the state forest estate, which makes them a key target for improving voluntary compliance in absence of increased enforcement. So I'll quickly work through now a few of these components of the research that we have worked on so far. We've completed a systematic review of the evidence base, and we were looking specifically for evidence that interrogated the overlap between human behaviour, environmental management and regulation or compliance. And we started off with 290 articles. I won't go through the details of the protocol, but we ended up with 44 articles that we looked at in detail. The management implications that we drew out of this evidence base, that first one there, that there's evidence that this really can be fruitful to combine traditional deterrence strategies and behaviourally informed strategies. Because that balance between having, the carrot and the stick, or compliance and communication, is really important. We found that in the evidence there's a lot of reliance on self-report and self-reporting attitudinal measures as sort of proxy for behaviour change conclusions. So we really think it's important to note that attitudes, while they're important and they may be important predictors of behaviour, they're not actually behaviour itself, and they cannot be measured as such. So it's important that if we're going to start looking to affect human behaviour in regulatory environmental regulation, we need to include observational data or infringement reporting as part of the evidence base, as to really sort of ground truth what we're seeing in the self-reports. We also saw that's really important that there's different understandings of compliance and pro-environmental behaviours across the human population. So while a regulatory frame might be quite dichotomous, as in, right or wrong, yes or no, there's individuals actually have a variety of ways of thinking and perceiving their own personal behaviour in response to those rules. So a range of factors such as risk perception, their personality, extroversion or introversion tendencies, cultural worldview is quite influential, and also your life goals and aspirations were found to be important variables in the way that each individual responds to regulations. So we really see this as an opportunity to develop customised interventions using that behavioural insights framing around shared social values rather than just a yes-no approach to the rules. And the final point there is that the evidence base showed that there's a lot of investment, especially in behaviour change research, up front in collecting data about people's attitudes and views, but not necessarily following all the steps through design of the intervention and then evaluation to see if it actually affected behaviour change in response to the regulation. So we really need to expand our data set, make sure that we are documenting and looking for evidence of actual behaviour change. Now, slowly running out of time here, we did do a media content analysis, which has just wrapped up. So unfortunately, I can't really report much there at this stage. I don't want to take up too much time. But what we found to be most interesting is delving into the social media response to where the regulator is communicating about rules or particular restraints and restrictions, and looking into the comments, that opportunity to hear directly from the affected community through this social media interface. We've just wrapped up a statewide survey where we collected over 3,000 individual respondents. We're looking there for to address a range of hypotheses that emerge from our systematic review. And central to the hypotheses is this idea that we're looking for how can we improve voluntary compliance with environmental regulation. And to do so, we've combined a mix of pre-tested and psychometrically validated scales with context-specific questionnaires as well. And the grey highlights there are the ones that are pre-existing survey instruments. So the survey closed just today, so I can't really share results, I'm sorry, but hopefully next year I'll be back and I can give you a bit more detail about these various components of the project. I'll just leave you there with some references and thank you for your time.